Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Cunningham. I'm the Executive Director of Oxford University's North American office based in New York. And on behalf of my colleagues throughout the University of Oxford community, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. I've had the honor and privilege of working for Oxford for over 29 years, and I've often been asked, just what exactly is it that makes Oxford so unique? Well, there are lots of answers, of course, but perhaps the most direct is the university's commitment to excellence. Whether it's through its research, its teaching, preservation of collections, or dissemination of knowledge, Oxford's commitment to excellence across multiple disciplines, from medicine to the humanities to the social sciences, simply cannot be matched. But I've reflected on this question over the years. I've also come to realize that what really makes Oxford particularly unique is the way in which this commitment to excellence can be found in unexpected areas. And the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, happily referred to as WildCRU, is a lovely example of this. A commitment to excellence where normally one would not expect to find it in Oxford. Who would think that one of the world's leading conservation research units would be based in Oxford? How did this happen? Why is it there? Well, of course, the story starts with a commitment to excellence, initially made by Professor David MacDonald, the founding director of WildCRU. David is a professor of zoology and a fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, and armed with a vision and a great deal of zeal for his mission, Professor MacDonald launched WildCRU in 1986. Happily, David found a kindred spirit right here in New York when he met the Oxonian philanthropist Tom Kaplan. Through the Panthera Foundation, Tom and his wife Daphne have provided support for WildCRU over many years, helping it take root and to thrive. And this in turn has helped others join in supporting WildCRU through its important mission. And many of those people are on this call today. And so on our behalf, we thank you. Like all excellent leaders, Professor MacDonald has taken special care to ensure a smooth transition as he hands the reins of WildCRU off to its new director, Professor Amy Dickman. Before I introduce Amy, I'd just like to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. First, to note that this session will last about an hour. It is being recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. Please direct your questions to the Q&A section or feature at the bottom of your screen, and Amy Dickman will do her best to field them and answer them with her colleague. At the end of the session, we will put up a slide which will provide additional information about WildCRU and also information about how to make a gift in its support if you're so inclined. Professor Amy Dickman is Kaplan Senior Research Fellow in Wildcat Conservation within WildCRU, and also a member of the Department of Zoology and Pembroke College. She is a conservation biologist with a particular interest in the maintenance of threatened wildlife populations on human-dominated land and how to resolve human and wildlife conflict. Her work focuses mainly on understanding the drivers of conflict between humans and large carnivores and how these issues can be best addressed. She is a member of the African Lion Working Group, the IUCN Cat Specialist Group, a founding member of the Pride Lion Conservation Alliance, a National Geographic explorer, and the joint CEO of Lion Landscapes. She has been with the WildCRU full-time since 2009, and as I mentioned, was recently appointed its new director. So at this point, it's my pleasure to hand this proceedings over to Professor Amy Dickman.
Thank you so much, Michael, and it is a huge honor and a privilege to be with all of you tonight. So thank you very, very much for taking the time. Michael's given a great introduction there to what WildCRU really is and has shown that passion and that support that is at the heart of it. The passion that David had when he founded WildCRU in 1986 has really blossomed through those decades past and really grown into what we see today, which is a very impactful unit that has reached all the way across the world. We have a particular expertise and focus on wildcat conservation. That's, as you heard, my main expertise, which Michael was referring to, particularly with lions, and is some of what you'll be hearing more about today, obviously with Andy's presentation as well. This is a really exciting time for WildCRU. I've always been passionate about it for as long as I can remember, from when I was a and undergraduates, my overall dream was to join WildCRU and to really sort of, be a part of this unit that seemed so impactful in what it was doing around the world. And so it's been a huge privilege to join it and now to become its director. And Andy has stepped up also as a deputy director this year. So it's a really exciting time for us at WildCRU, and we hope for you as well, because you've all been huge supporters of our work. And it's something that any success that we have is truly your success as well. So without taking any more time, I'm going to introduce Andrew. So Andy Loveridge runs one of the most significant projects that we have here at WildCRU. One of our strengths is long-term field research projects, because that long-term commitment to an area in a field of study really enables us to get the best available science and data for understanding conservation problems and critically building the local relationships that we need to ensure that whichever solutions are developed are appropriate and locally co-developed. So Andy has been running the Trans-Kalahari Predator Programme now for over 15 years now, I believe. So he's really been an exemplar of this work. And so he's going to talk you through it, some of his journey and the lessons we've learned through the TKPP work, which really just gives you a flavour of the kind of work that many of you have been supporting through WildCRU today. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Thanks very much, Amy and Michael. That's for your very kind introductions. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's go, Michael. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for signing up to hear my talk. So before I start, I'd like to recognize Americans for Oxford and their team, and for all the hard work they've put into setting this up and publicizing this event. They've really done an amazing job. I'd also like to extend our thanks to the many supporters of WildCRU's work. I know there are many of you signed up to this lecture, so a really big thank you to you. The research and conservation work I'm going to talk about would not have been possible without your generosity. Finally, I'd like to thank the research team, graduate students, collaborators, and colleagues who have contributed to this work over very many years. So to give you some background, I started working on lion behavior and conservation nearly 23 years ago in Wangi National Park, Zimbabwe, when at the invitation of national parks and concerned safari operators, David MacDonald and I started a research project on lions. The project was largely designed to investigate the impacts of trophy hunting on lion population dynamics. Since then, the scope of the study and its spatial coverage has expanded. From gaining an understanding of the impacts of hunting, we moved on to research on the ecology of lions in the Wangi ecosystem, an ecosystem that is very different from other areas where lions have been studied. It also soon became apparent that conflict with people was a huge issue that needed to be understood and mitigated, and this prompted us to begin work in that area. And finally, because our work showed that lion populations in this ecosystem use vast areas and require huge tracts of protected land to be viable, we started work to understand landscape connectivity and population dynamics across the wider Kavango-Zambezi landscape, which spans 5 countries in Central Southern Africa. To recognize that the geographical scope of the project goes way beyond the Wangi ecosystem and now spans much of the Kalahari Basin, we branded the larger project the Trans-Kalahari Predator Program, or TKPP for short. This project falls under the wider WildCRU banner. To date, this research project has generated over 100 scientific publications and 9 Oxford doctorates. You can find more about the project on the WildCRU website and follow updates on Instagram if you wish. In this talk, I'm going to talk about 2 particular aspects of our team's research and conservation work. Firstly, prioritizing landscape scale conservation. And secondly, understanding them and mitigating human-lion conflict. These might be the single most important factors in determining the future of Africa's lions. So we estimate that at the turn of the last century, there were around 200,000 lions in sub-Saharan Africa. with historical lion range shown in brown in this map. Our research using cutting-edge landscape connectivity models based on movement data we have collected on lions shows that by 1970, lion habitat had declined by over 60%, and populations had plummeted to around 90,000 individuals. This map shows connected lion habitat across Africa at that time, with dark blue colors showing highly connected and brown colors least well-connected habitats. This habitat model shows that even though diminished from historical times, vast areas of savanna habitat, even outside protected areas, were likely still inhabited by lions 50 years ago. However, by the early part of this century, lion range and populations had severely declined. Using the same analytical techniques, but with updated data reflecting the burgeoning human population and expanding clearance of wild habitats for agriculture, we find that connected lion habitat now occupies 12% of its historical extent. The most suitable habitats for lions are largely within protected areas, and much of the habitat lying outside these refuges has disappeared. Lion numbers have declined by 75% to around 23,000 individuals since 1970. That is the loss of 1,400 lions a year for the last 5 decades. The drivers of declining lion range and populations are largely attributable to human activity. Human populations have increased massively since the middle of the last century. There were 177 million people in sub-Saharan Africa in 1950. There are 1.3 billion today. Population will double again by the middle of the century to around 2.5 billion. To feed Africa's burgeoning population, it is estimated that 430 million hectares of land will need to be cleared to plant crops in sub-Saharan Africa by 2060. And this is equivalent to about 50% of the land area of the continental United States. This will result in huge losses of wild habitat. And you can see from this aerial photograph the clearance of land for farming right up to the boundary of a protected area in Western Zimbabwe. The cleared farmland on the left of the slide is uninhabitable for most large-bodied wild African mammals, including lions. Boundaries like this form the interface between people and wildlife, where significant human-wildlife conflict occurs. As you can see from these maps, showing respectively the demand for agricultural land in 2060 and the current distribution of lion populations, that the highest demand for agricultural land, with the dark colors in the left-hand map, coincide very closely with lion range across Africa, with the core lion areas depicted in red on the right-hand map. The threat of habitat loss has huge implications for the conservation of lions. So what does the future hold for Africa's lions? We know that African protected areas, where most stable lion populations persist, are catastrophically underfunded, with as many as 82% of them currently failing or deteriorated. Again, using landscape connectivity models, we simulated what might happen to lion habitat given the increase in human populations and development expected by the middle of the century. So we know that there are currently approximately 23,000 lions in around 2.7 million square kilometers of suitable connected habitat, shown by the colored polygons on this map, with red areas being the most highly connected or most viable areas for lions. The green areas show habitat that connects core lion habitat. However, we know that human populations are expected to more than double, with significant agricultural expansion in the next 50 years, and these areas of connecting habitat, mostly outside protected area networks, will be most at risk. By 2050, assuming that all currently protected areas remain viable and protected, we predict that lion habitat will decline by 57%. However, we know that many protected areas are likely to fail. And if we lose 25% of protected areas that are most vulnerable, 81% of lion habitat will disappear, along with nearly 20% of Africa's remaining lions. If 3/4 of protected areas fail and are lost, 87% of current lion habitat will be lost to development and agriculture, and lion populations will decline by 40%. Declines in lion range and population size have been accompanied by loss of genetic diversity, which could further imperil this iconic savanna species. This slide shows some research led by Simon Durers, looking at declining genetic diversity in lion populations across Southern Africa compared to historical times. The study compared genetic diversity of modern samples compared with 19th century samples from museums. We showed that genetic diversity in modern lion populations was reduced by approximately 15% compared to historical populations. The rapid decline in allelic richness after 1895 suggests the erosion of genetic diversity coincides with the rise of European colonization and the resulting declines in regional lion numbers. So small, isolated inbred populations that we're starting to see in lions are significantly more at risk of extinction from stochastic events, such as disease and inbreeding depression. A recent genetic study shows that at least 50 prides of lions is required to maintain a population's genetic diversity. What we see is that the majority of lion populations are not large enough to ensure this genetic viability. This highlights the importance of maintaining current lion populations and habitat, and where possible, linking populations together to ensure there is sufficient genetic exchange to ensure adequate levels of genetic diversity. Protecting the extensive landscapes shown in red on this map is absolutely critical for the future of lions and probably most mammalian biodiversity in Africa. So I'm now going to turn to talking in more detail about the Kavango-Zambezi Trans-Frontier area and TKPP's work there. The Kavango-Zambezi, or KAZA for short, is shown in the purple circle on this map, and it's one of the last remaining lion strongholds in Africa. So I've told you a lot of depressing things so far in this talk, so here's the good news. Some of the remaining lion landscapes are vast wilderness areas, and this is a map of KAZA, which is one of them. And this is where I've done most of my research work over the last 2 decades. So KAZA is a huge landscape that has been designated by the governments of Angola, Namibia, Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe as a transboundary conservation area, with priority given to biodiversity conservation and wildlife-based economies. It covers an area of 520,000 square kilometers, and this area is twice the size of the UK, the United Kingdom, larger than Germany and Austria combined, and about 20% larger than California. The area encompasses 26 national parks, nearly 300 forest reserves, and over 100 wildlife management areas. It's also the home to 1 in 10 of Africa's remaining lions. As we've seen, conserving connectivity between lion populations and avoiding isolation is critical. Landscape ecology helps us to understand animal movements in the landscape and to prioritize conservation actions. So using movement data from dispersing male lions fitted with GPS collars, we modeled the fine-scale habitat use of lions. Firstly, we calculated the connectivity of core lion areas in KAZA, shown on this map. This predicts how suitable the habitat is for lion movements, with generally most connected habitats in reds and yellows in this map, centered on the largest and best managed protected areas. We prioritized these based on their connectedness and size, with one being the highest priority. The Okavango-Wangi region, the Zambezi Valley, the Kafue ecosystem, and the Central Kalahari are the highest prioritized core habitats. We then modeled the more tenuous connections between these core habitats to represent movement corridors that lions might occasionally use to cross unprotected areas between core populations and ensure gene flow between populations. These were again prioritized based on the corridor strength and value in connecting adjacent core habitat, with one being the highest priority. These prioritizations allow policymakers to take decisions on the most critical parts of the KAZA landscape on which to focus protective measures. So what do we do with this information? If we are to avoid the most catastrophic scenarios, we need to work with conservation policymakers to plan future conservation in order to prioritize for the best conservation outcomes. So we work with conservation managers to share our work and ensure that our research is considered in future conservation planning. These photos show meetings we've held with policymakers in KAZA countries, in this case in Botswana. Some of the prioritized corridors we identified have already been included in spatial planning in the Botswana National Spatial Plan, suggesting that it is possible to influence future conservation and improve future outcomes. However, even with the best conservation planning in place, lions will still leave protected areas, either on short forays to find food or mates, or to move between populations. And this inevitably means coming into conflict or contact with rural communities. This photo shows the result of such a foray, with a family's cow killed and eaten by lions during the night. Again, we've used landscape connectivity models to identify human conflict hotspots, which are the red and yellow areas in this map of KAZA. And we have established coexistent projects in the areas we predict to be most seriously affected. In the second part of this talk, I'll tell you a bit more about some of the initiatives we have implemented at these sites to try and improve people's tolerance of lions and to help and enhance people's livelihoods. So attitudes towards a species can be a key determinant of whether there is a societal motivation to conserve them. As a highly charismatic species, lions are greatly valued by global society. So colleagues in WildCRU studying the effect of species charisma on conservation potential of a wide range of mammalian taxa found that across 5 English-speaking countries, that's India, UK, USA, Australia, and South Africa, lions rank 3rd after tigers and elephants in people's affections and preferences. In contrast, surveys led by WildCRU doctoral student Lovemore Sabanda, a Zimbabwean student of ours, of subsistence farmers living adjacent to Wangi National Park and KAZA, show that people living in these communities universally dislike lions. On a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 being deeply dislike, lions along with spotted hyenas score on average very close to 1. In contrast, other conflict-causing species, such as elephants, or jackals, or leopards, or wild dogs, score between 2 or 3. And this is not very surprising, because in the same survey, we found that 41% of households had been affected by predation on their livestock, of which 14% had been affected by lions and 18% by hyenas over the previous 12 months. Livestock losses are costly for farmers who are relatively poor. Average annual losses to lions sit between 150 and 200 US dollars. And to put this in context, annual per capita domestic income is around $600. So this represents a significant impact on livelihoods. And this likely explains some of the animosity people have towards predators. The result of this conflict can also have serious implications for lions. When lions habitually kill people's livestock or endanger people's lives, they are often killed in retaliation. In fact, of the nearly 300 lion mortality records from around Wangi National Park over the last 20 years, anthropogenic mortality of lions, or mortality caused by people, far exceeds natural forms of mortality, making up close to 80% of the records. This level of additional mortality can disrupt demographic processes and cause populations to decline. So in this photo, taken in a village just outside Wangi National Park, these men are clowning for the camera. However, the reality is that living alongside dangerous predators is far from easy and comes with a significant cost. Costs can often be economic, such as loss of livestock, but also psychological, as living alongside wild animals can be frightening and dangerous, even for people who are used to them. So how do we help people coexist with lions? It seems clear that people are most likely to tolerate lions if the costs they bear are eased or mitigated and are balanced with benefits from living with wildlife. So activities such as tourism, where revenue is generated based on the existence of wild species and wild habitat, is an obvious benefit, as long as revenue reaches the local communities. And many of the protected areas across KAZA have a vibrant tourism industry that generates significant revenue for local economies. That is, of course, before we had 2 years of COVID travel restrictions, which decimated the travel industry globally and affected all travel in Southern Africa. So benefits derived from activities such as tourism are important in building tolerance for wild species. But mitigating the costs of coexisting with large predators such as lions is equally important. So I'm going to tell you about some of the lion conflict mitigation work that my team undertake. So in response to high levels of livestock loss to farmers living on the edge of Wangi National Park, we started a program called the Long Shields Community Guardians. And we've replicated this approach more recently in northern Botswana. This program is modeled on the very successful Lion Guardians program in Kenya, where Maasai Marans or warriors would traditionally hunt and kill lions, are co-opted to monitor and protect lions and their local communities. The Zimbabwean program is named for the local Ndebele people, who were historically known as the people of the long shields for the tall rawhide shields their soldiers carried. Our long shields team of 9 men and 2 women are hired from the local community and themselves live and farm in the area. Their role is to protect and warn local farmers if lions are in the area, to educate people about lions and conservation, and to train people in livestock protection strategies, and to actively deter lions using non-lethal deterrence methods. So in these images, you can see the Guardian team tracking lions on the national park boundary and rescuing lost livestock that might otherwise be vulnerable to predation by lions and other large predators. So I mentioned that the Lion Guardian team actively deter lions using non-lethal methods. The program fits GPS collars to lions living in the park periphery that might be expected to come into conflict with people. When these lions move into the community farmland, the Guardian team alert local people to bring in or guard their livestock. The team also trained to chase the lions back into the protected area by creating noise and disturbance that lions dislike. They use plastic trumpets called vuvuzelas. These are often used by South African football fans at matches. This noise is frequently enough to get the lions moving back to the park and away from livestock and human settlements. So to give you a sense of what a lion hazing event is like, I have a video embedded in the slide, which was taken by one of the team on a cell phone. The accompanying soundtrack will give you an idea of the noise deterrence made when the Guardian team are hazing a lion. You'll notice that one of the team is tracking the lion with the telemetry antenna. So here's the sound.
Hello.
So, does hazing lions work? It's usually very successful at chasing lions in the short term, and we've evaluated the technique on GPS-collared lions over several years. in a study led by doctoral student Lizanne Petrarca. As you might expect, there are many factors that determine the success of a chase. Proximity to the park's boundary, small prides of lions are easier to deter, and lions from socially stable prides are easier to chase off, and season plays a big role. Social stability is particularly interesting, as we find that prides with cubs that have lost their territorial male, often through trophy hunting, leave the protected area to avoid infanticide by new males. These prides are much harder to deter, as they are also avoiding interactions with other lions. And this illustrates the complexities of conflict situations. Long-term success in permanently deterring lions from entering farmland depends on reinforcement of the deterrence, or how often the lions are chased, and to some extent on the age, sex, demographic of the lion, with young lions more easily discouraged. So livestock husbandry also greatly influences the levels of predation, and protection of livestock at night is crucial. Large predators are often nocturnal, particularly when they are in farmland. So cattle are traditionally housed in protective enclosures or bomas at night to provide them with protection. You can see a traditional wooden stockade or boma in this photo. However, cattle are not always well cared for. And our data from predation records shows that the vast majority of predation incidents occur when cattle are left out in grazing areas at night, which is shown in the white bar on the right panel of this graph. They are less often attacked during the day or when protected in a boma at night. So a really easy way to reduce livestock loss and therefore reduce levels of conflict between lions and local farmers is to improve livestock enclosures or bomas. So these photos show some of the bomas we help people build, and we've built several hundred of these. The photo shows static defenses on the bottom left of the slide, and on top right, communal bomas that can be moved between sites. The static bomas are basically chain link enclosures that keep the animals protected. Both of these types of protective enclosure greatly improve the protection of livestock at night. And to date, no predator attacks have occurred at our boma sites. Livestock loss has also declined over time in our mitigation sites. And this is in turn reducing the levels of illegal retaliatory killing of lions by local farmers, with 13 lions illegally killed in the 4 years before the program started, compared to only 2 in the 4 years after the program was initiated. So I want to tell you a bit about the communal mobile bomas that we primarily use in Zimbabwe. So these are opaque PVC canvas screens that are sited on fallow crop fields. Because predators can't see inside the enclosure, they appear unwilling to challenge the walls. The cattle are kept inside the boma at night, and they fertilize the soil within the enclosure with dung and urine. The bomas are moved between field sites every few weeks. And as you can see from these photos, the soil on the sites treated with mobile bomas is greatly improved, and crops grown on fields that have been treated are more productive and healthy and produce higher yields. And this provides a significant benefit to farmers who use these methods, which is particularly important in an area where food insecurity is high. You can clearly see the difference between maize cobs grown on treated fields on the right and untreated plots on the left of the image. Crops grown on boma treated fields produce more larger seed cobs. So this might seem a really long way from mitigating human-lion conflicts. However, we know that people who perceive they are receiving benefits are more likely to tolerate the presence of wild animals, as our surveys of the factors that contribute to forming local people's attitudes to lions clearly shows. In this case, people benefit from improved food security, whilst at the same time protecting their livestock more effectively. So, the critical evidence that conflict mitigation is successful is the change in people's attitudes and perceptions before and after the initiation of the Long Shields program. A survey led by Oxford grad student Lovemore Sabanda shows that 91% of survey respondents felt that livestock protection had improved as a result of the Guardian's activities, and 87% that livestock loss had decreased, along with 64% who felt more positively towards lions. Understandably, people still worried about lion predation and were fearful of the dangers that lions pose to their safety, with only 52% and 32% responding positively to these questions. These results suggest that the project is addressing some of the attitudinal factors that contribute to human-lion conservation conflicts. However, some of the more deep-seated attitudes to lions, such as concerns about safety, are much harder to address and require long-term engagement. So in concluding this talk, I'll leave you with this final image of a beautiful lion in Wangi National Park. I hope that by taking you from a continental landscape scale perspective of lion conservation to how benefiting local people's livelihoods at the scale of individual crop fields demonstrates that lion conservation, and indeed any conservation, needs to be tackled at multiple scales. Conservation needs to span working with national and international policymakers to ensuring people benefit from practical on-the-ground initiatives to limit the costs they bear and provide incentives to coexist with wild species. Ultimately, the future of Africa's lions will be determined by how strong our strategy is for conserving the remaining habitat in intact wildlife landscapes, but also on whether African people living alongside these magnificent but dangerous creatures are willing to tolerate their presence. So thank you so much for listening to the seminar. I really appreciate your time. And I'll now pass you back to Amy Dickman, who will chair the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was great. Really exciting to see all of that in such a sort of just all of the whole of it come together in that really great story. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to run through the Q&A section. So quite a few people had sent in questions beforehand. So we've got quite a long list of questions that we can deal with that way. And there are also, I see, questions and answers coming in through the Q&A box at the bottom. So if you have any questions, then please do feel free to add them in there. There is probably going to be more questions coming in than we will have time to deal with, just to warn everyone, but we'll get through as many as we can. And the way it's going to work, obviously, Andy and I both work on lions and lion conservation. So any easy question that comes in, or a question that's going to make me look good, I'll take it. Any of the harder, more difficult, more challenging questions, we're going to pass straight on to Andy. So I'm going to use the moderator's privilege for that. Okay, so Andy, jumping straight into, I'm going to start with one of the ones that came in earlier. So how has safari tourism helped and or hindered the work that you do? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, we work in these big national parks, and there's often safari tour operators who own lodges there, and they run tourism activities. We work very closely with them, actually, because I mean, we really engage with people on the ground. It's really valuable to us to have those relationships with people on the ground. We learn a lot from safari guides. They're hugely knowledgeable people, and we share a lot of our information with them as well. So it's a two-way relationship. Safari companies really help us. Some of them sponsor some of our work, and we have just a great relationship with them.
That's great. Yeah, I think nothing particularly to add then, apart from just to say I completely agree. It's working with all the different stakeholders and making sure that we sort of all focus on where we have our common ground, thinking about conservation. So questions literally pouring in here. I'm going to ask one more here. So sort of something that we will all relate to, obviously, the recent pandemic and the ongoing pandemic. So how has COVID-19 impacted your work in Wangi, or more broadly, conservation?
Yeah, so I think, well, there's two parts to that question, I think. So, I mean, our work in Wangi has pretty much carried on. We've got a fantastic field team. They're in place. They've had a couple of periods of quarantine, but they've more or less carried on doing the work. So that's been fantastic. COVID's really affected the travel industry. It's absolutely decimated it. A lot of support for conservation comes from revenues from the travel industry, and that's been hugely affected. Jobs have been affected, and when people are unemployed and they're desperate, that's when they turn to bushmeat snaring, and so we've certainly seen that increase as well. As people just are absolutely desperate to survive. So it's had a big impact on conservation for sure.
Definitely, and we've all seen just how much it has disproportionately affected poor people already, so it really exacerbates that poverty. And I think the work like what you're doing in Wangi and what actually a lot of the WildCRU projects do, where it's very locally based, actually the resilience of those projects through things like COVID, where it's not as reliant on direct users or external people, is a real strength. Actually, I think we've seen of community-based conservation approaches like that.
Absolutely, that resilience is very definitely a huge advantage of what we do. Definitely.
So lots of questions coming in about trophy hunting, because you mentioned obviously the impact that was having. So I'm going to try and just group the answers together, or the questions together, because there's lots of very similar questions. But basically, what is being done? That was one of the key anthropogenic causes of mortality you identified. Can you just summarize what's being done to try to address that? Is it being addressed in some way?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what we need to understand is that trophy hunting is kind of very much part of the fabric of conservation in Africa. So about half of all the protected areas in Africa were originally set aside as trophy hunting areas. So if we said we're going to stop trophy hunting tomorrow, far more wild animals would die than trophy hunters ever kill if those areas were converted to farmland. So it's really part of the landscape. And I think what we have to do is really ensure that it's really well managed. And so we work a lot with authorities to really kind of work with them to make sure it's well managed, to make sure it's not going to be detrimental to wildlife populations. And I think that's really the key. I think the other thing is that do we need to find alternatives to trophy hunting? And I think that's another thing to be looking at. I think there's a lot of work going on about that. How can land be used for other things? How can revenues be generated to protect conservation areas from other sources? So there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah, 100%. And I think really the work that particularly Peter Lindsay and others have really done has shown that the fact that there is such a dearth already of funding that's needed to protect. You touched on there's extensive protected areas. We need a lot more revenue streams as well. We need to really think about new ways of funding conservation and making sure that it's done in a way that is very much that builds on the rights and the responsibilities with local people, not just imposed externally. So I think we need to be rethinking conservation quite broadly. But I know you and I could chat a long time, so I'm not going to get distracted.
We could do a whole seminar series on this.
We could, totally. Okay, so a slightly more light-hearted question to bring into it, or though a serious one. So how do you stay safe or even alive in your research environment?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm rather hoping that the Departmental Health and Safety Officer is not listening to this.
Please, please turn off your camera.
Turn them off. But yeah, I think I spent a lot of my kind of time in the field finding lions, often trying to catch them and immobilize them and put radio collars on them. So it's an inherently dangerous thing to do. But and we've had a couple of, I think, hairy moments, but I've never really felt particularly unsafe doing that. And I think primarily because lions, they're not out to get you. They're trying to avoid people, actually. So if you're sensible, they're not a threat. The things that are a threat are the kind of small things that are looking to bite you, and things like mosquitoes and malaria. And anyone who's worked in Africa for any period has had malaria, and that's not a fun thing. So that's the sort of unsafe part of the job, I think. Yeah,
definitely. I remember having this debate a lot with my husband when I got pregnant, and particularly when I was out there for a long period of the pregnancy. He was really traumatized I was going to get eaten by a lion or something. And finally, I remember coming back to Oxfordshire for a brief break, and it was during that time I had a crash on the A40, not my fault, I would like to say, but and ended up in hospital because of that. And I remember thinking everyone focuses on the threats from lions, etc. It seems very dramatic and different, but actually we all face dangers in our normal lives. And like you say, it's just about understanding those risks and trying to mitigate it and trying to put it in the right context and think about what's really more dangerous, as you say, things like malaria or poisonous snakes or people and cars often.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so talking about the mobile bomas, there's a lot of interest in those. So a couple of questions that I'll again sort of condense into one. So firstly, do lions jump over any of these bomas in your experience? So could they get in that way and potentially cause maybe surplus killing, you know, if a lion gets in there? And how long do they stay in the same place?
Okay, so 2 questions there. So the mobile bomas are great, actually. And I think, you know, people who catch wild animals in Africa know this, is that if you have a kind of opaque barrier, it's very seldom that a wild animal will try get over it or under it or through it. And that seems to be why these bomas work. So a lion comes up to them, they can't see the other side, doesn't try and jump over for some reason. You know, those kind of traditional kind of wooden stockades are much more vulnerable because lions can jump over them. They can, you know, get over easier, and that's where you kind of get this sort of surplus killing of domestic stock. So we've never actually had an attack on one of our mobile bomas in, I think it's probably nearly close to 10 years. So they really do work from that point of view. So how often do we move the bomas? It's about every 2 weeks. So 2 weeks is enough to fertilize a patch of field, and then you move the boma onto the next patch and fertilize a new field. So it's about every 2 weeks that we move them. And the lion guardians are very, very closely involved in that. They manage that process.
Excellent. And actually that brings me on really well to another question that's come up about, it starts with the lion guardians, but actually it's relevant, I think, to a lot of the project, which is how is this kind of work paid for? So presumably those people are all paid on the ground. So one of the questions was, how are people paid? And how is this project sustainable kind of in the longer term? Is it all related, you know, is it all reliant on donations, for example?
Yes, I mean, the answer to the first part of that question is that we're heavily reliant on grants and philanthropy to pay our project staff and to keep the projects running. You know, conservation is desperately underfunded. So, you know, we rely on that support, and, you know, probably will rely on that support for the foreseeable future, because, you know, African countries are poor and it's hard to turn these into sort of sustainable projects. But you know, I think there are ways that we sort of investigating, and some people are starting to use. So for instance, colleagues of mine who also use mobile bomas up towards Victoria Falls, we collaborate with them very closely. They're getting farmers to plant millet in their fields, and those farmers sell that millet to a local microbrewery. And so they're getting revenue from you know, using these bomas, and that helps to sustain the kind of bomas and the use of bomas. So that's one way you can do it. You know, there's a big initiative called you know, herding for health, or One Health. So, you know, getting people to look after their livestock better, to take on kind of sort of modern husbandry kind of practices, to, you know, have better herds, healthier herds, make those herds more commercially viable, and earn money for the farmers. That's another way we can make this all sustainable. And also, like, linking the tourism industry into that, where, you know, at the moment, you know, safari camps import all their meat, often from South Africa, bizarrely. You know, if they could sustain all that locally, then, you know, that kind of benefits everybody. So I think there are kind of, you know, initiatives that you can introduce to make a lot of this more sustainable.
Definitely. I think, yeah, you've covered the absolutely key things there, that we can't really expect, you know, the poorest people in the world to maintain these animals who are often really valued by the richest people in the world. And we have to so accept the fact that we are going to be paying more externally for this for a long time. But all those diverse mechanisms you talk about are really important for making this just, it engages more people, it makes it more sustainable beyond just philanthropic funding. But philanthropic funding is so important. And for many of the people on this call, that's how they've been supporting conservation. And it really does show. I think also the COVID pandemic has really highlighted how important that philanthropic funding was. People worry it isn't sustainable, but we've seen a real sustained interest actually in funding conservation. So that's been great.
Absolutely.
Just another question that's come up. So do you see any new or emerging threats? You've touched on some of the really key ones that we know about: habitat, you know, fragmentation and loss, conflict with people. are the new or emerging threats to predators that you're seeing over time sort of come up?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the one that concerns me a lot, and I think concerns a lot of conservationists, is trade in parts. So we've seen a kind of an increase in poaching of lions to harvest their teeth and claws and bones, and those parts are illegally traded. And that sort of seems to be an emerging threat. We've not seen it in the kind of KAZA landscape, but it certainly affected places like Limpopo National Park in Mozambique, where a very high proportion of lions have been poached for body parts. So that sort of seems to be something that we need to really keep an eye on and understand better, and it's a threat we need to protect against.
Very much so, yeah, absolutely. Someone was asking on the Q&A about land use planning. So saying, KAZA is becoming fragmented. So how is that going to be managed in the future? Do you have any kind of insights particularly on that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And actually it's something that we're quite involved in. So I mean, KAZA is very keen to actually do all this kind of land use planning. And actually we're involved in planning a corridor from Kafue National Park to the sort of main body of KAZA, and actually looking at all the land use plans in that area, all the kind of livelihood kind of activities, merging all the national land use plans as well, and also figuring out whether that is actually going to improve connectivity of those areas for things like lions and elephants and all the wild species that we need to be moving through those corridors to maintain genetic diversity. So yeah, it's very much kind of on the agenda, and we're very much involved in that.
Definitely. And actually another question that's just come in that I think is really related to that point is, given the huge predicted changes, and you showed some of the maps on land use change and population pressure and resource consumption and everything that's affecting these populations, do you think it's realistic that we will have adequate lion sort of corridors and connectivity across these sites? Or should we really be thinking about just saying we're going to sort of just focus on the core protected areas and maybe do more of a firefighting approach for that?
Yeah, so I mean, we absolutely have to protect the core populations. I mean, that is critical. If we don't do that, lions are gone. But I think there is scope to kind of identify the key corridors and say, how can we protect these? It might be that, carbon credits might do it. If people pay for the maintenance of woodland through carbon credits, those areas might remain. And those are the kind of sort of innovative things that we need to be thinking of to try and conserve habitat outside protected areas, because otherwise we're going to be dealing with island populations, and that comes with a whole new sort of management approach.
Definitely. And as you say, I mean, the climate and the carbon credits are interesting, because I know that another WildCRU work that we do with Lion Landscapes, working with biocarbon partners, is looking at how do we make carbon credits, incorporate biodiversity right up to lions, and saying how can you have premium carbon credits that then do incentivize not only the protection of habitat, which is key, but the direct protection of top species like lions. And I think the other reason all of what you say is totally key about, we have to maintain some of that, but also for the value for local people. This wildlife can, if we did it well, be a real driver of economic and social development if those rights and benefits all came to the local people. So I think there is potential there that we would lose if we also just restricted back to those islands that we talk about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And your sort of lion carbon project is a fantastic example of incentivizing habitat protection through kind of these innovative means.
Definitely. So there are more questions coming in than we're ever going to have time to answer. So I'm going to scoot through just a couple more. And I know Michael emerged to tell us we've got to stop in a minute. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment, rightfully so, about decolonization and dealing with sort of obviously rights in conservation. So how do you think that is addressed in a project like this, thinking about local rights and focusing on that side of things?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important conversation to be having, very topical at the moment. But I think it's something that we've known about for a very long time on our project, and I think in WildCRU in general. So, we really work hard to involve local communities in conservation. You've seen the lion guardians and what they do. They're all part of that local community. They're chosen by the community to do those jobs. So we really kind of try to work with local communities at that sort of level. the other thing is, training people is critical because, a lot of people don't have opportunities for better education in poor countries. And WildCRU does extremely well with this, as you know. We have the postgraduate diploma course, which brings fantastic young conservationists from all over the world to Oxford. They do an amazing course and they go back to their home countries with this kind of confidence and with all this training. So that's really critical. On the project, we've had a long kind of a long-term really kind of engagement with training graduates. And actually, that's been heavily supported by North American philanthropy. A couple of people have really kind of committed to long-term kind of support of that. And we've had several kind of doctoral students come through WildCRU. The most recent being Lovridge Sabanda. I showed you some of his work in the talk. So he's just got his doctorate and he's gone back to Zimbabwe, and he's a conservationist and a very, very well respected one in Zimbabwe. So I think providing those opportunities really has to happen.
That's great. And I see Michael's popped up as some harbinger of doom of the end of the podcast, but I'm just going to squeeze in two quick final questions. So the first one is going to be, could you tell everyone just an unusual behavior? This always puts people on the spot, but some kind of unusual behavior that most people might not know about lions.
Cool. So I think, we all know lions are really, really social animals. And I mean, that's no surprise really, but just how social they are and how cooperative they are really always amazes me. And the one thing that we've noticed they do, and sort of not a well-known kind of behavioral thing, that is that when a male takes over a pride of females, we know that they kill the cubs so they can bring the females into estrus and sire their own. The females often, that they don't cooperate with that, and they'll protect their cubs and they'll fight the male. What we've sometimes seen them do is, if the pride's got multiple cubs to multiple females, one of the females will take the cubs away, and she sort of becomes a sort of surrogate kind of mother to them. And the remaining females stay and mate with the male. It's almost as if like they're saying, well, I'll take the kids away and you stay here and you entertain the new guy. And so they sort of have this almost collaborative kind of approach to an infanticidal male, which is really cool, I think. And I know you've got some great stories about them.
Definitely, the females are always very very innovative in that way, and absolutely we have the same. I've seen females come into this, what they call the prepartum estrus, when there's a takeover suddenly, and often sometimes a heavily pregnant female will come into season and mate with the incoming males, and I've watched then the males a few days later, often just a week or two later, these cubs will sort of be there and the males are sort of looking cock a hoop and they're really pleased that they're so fertile, and you're thinking, you're so stupid, those aren't yours. But yeah, they're great. I love the sociality. Very final question before I hand over to Michael is just how can people get involved? How can people help lion conservation from listening to this?
Yeah, so I think we've spoken about philanthropy, and I think that's absolutely critical to what we do. People who support this work really, really help conservation. I think the other thing is, sharing expertise. And so we've had a great experience with a guy who had a career in tech, and he's passionate about tech and conservation, and he's helped us kind of merge the two to analyze our camera trap data using a very advanced kind of tech approach. Has really, really helped us actually. The other thing is networking. If you've got networks of kind of friends who like to support this kind of thing, please put us in touch, because that really helps us too. And I know Amy's going to travel out to New York soon, and if there's opportunities to meet people, I mean, she's there, I think.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was great. You could have done a lot more of it, definitely. I'm going to hand over to Michael now, and also just end by thanking everyone who's listening, and also everyone from Americans for Oxford again, and all the people who've supported us, both Andy's work, the broader WildCRU work. We really couldn't do without you. So over to Michael.
Thank you so much.
Well, one of the positive aspects of this format is, of course, we can have people join from all over the world, all over the country. But one of the negatives is we can't applaud you. So I will applaud on behalf of the hundreds of people who've joined us today, and to thank Amy and Andy for a really fascinating presentation. As I said at the top of this program, Oxford is about excellence. And I think this presentation has shown the excellence that is found in WildCRU, and also I think just how that research excellence is applied in so many unique and important ways to benefit both lions and to the people who live with lions. And so I certainly find that's a really heartening thing to take away from this important work. In just a moment, we'll be putting up a slide that will show information about, if you'd like to learn more about WildCRU, the WildCRU website. And also, if you'd like to get in touch with the North American office, you can see there's a way to use a QR code if you'd like to make a gift in support of WildCRU's work in that way. Or if you're not quick with QR codes these days, you can visit the Oxford North American website, Oxford NA, www.oxfordna, and find ways to give there, and type in WildCRU on the giving page, and you'll be able to give support in that way. And then last but not least, as I said earlier, this program has been recorded. We'll be putting it up on our YouTube station. So if you'd like to share it with others and build a network of people who are interested in supporting, interested and supportive of WildCRU, that would be a wonderful way to help. So again, on behalf of all of us at the North American office, and on behalf of Professors Andrew Loveridge and Amy Dickman, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again either in person or in one of these webinars in the not too distant future.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you.